Hi everyone, I am Katie and I am a leader at Solid Rock Youth. I do the 6-7 girls. We have a great time together. I miss seeing you all. So for my passage today, I'm doing Philippians 4 verses 10 to 23. So finishing off the end of Philippians before we move into the book of Mark, and I've been loving doing Philippians. It's been very rich, a lot of stuff going on in it all at once. So it's not boring for sure. So my passage starts with Paul. He begins, as always, as he seems to be doing this book, is rejoicing. But he says he rejoices this time for the Philippians for their concern for him, and they sent him this gift. But then he goes on to say he's not rejoicing because they gave him this gift. He explains that it's not the gift itself, because he's already learned how to be content if he has a lot or if he has a little. And I find this is a very well-known passage in the Bible where he talks about, I've learned what it means to be content with lots and with little. But I wanted to really go into what does it actually mean to look like to be content. And so a definition I found was it's an inward assurance of God's sovereignty and goodness that produces the fruit of joy and peace, regardless of what our circumstances is. So I think that's really applicable today during COVID pandemic when maybe we can't see our friends and we can't go to school, but we can still find contentment in that. And two reasons I was trying to think of, why is contentment so important? Why is Paul hammering this home? Well, one, as he's been going through this whole letter, is it's needed for unity. If we are not content, we might be envying other people's things or what they can do or where they are at in life. And we're not going to be in unison as a body of believers if we're not content, and instead we're being envious. It also helps us have endurance in times of suffering. And the Philippians, they were suffering. They were being persecuted. But when we can show contentment, when the Philippians could, and when we can today, when we look content, even when we're suffering or we're being persecuted, times are difficult, that's going to make the world look at us and say, what is different about them? What do they have that they can be content even right now? So contentment obviously isn't easy though. So I wanted to kind of go in to the next part that Paul says is he's already learned the secret of being content. And it's not like he's learned it and he's not going to tell it to us. He has told us that he has learned the secret to being content, and it is through Christ. And so Christ strengthens Paul to be content, and Christ can be the source of our contentment as well. He is sufficient for us, and even back in chapter 3, Paul talked about, I think it was verse 7, he talked about the surpassing worth of knowing Christ. And then later on in chapter 3, he talked about how our citizenship is in heaven. So nothing earthly is going to satisfy us because we belong to this earthly kingdom. So if we belong to a heavenly kingdom. We don't belong to the earth. Totally messed that up. But because we belong to that, we can't expect that on this life now that God is going to be blessing us with all these worldly treasures. Our inheritance is in heaven, and so that's where our hope is, and we can be content because we know that is in the future. And then after that, Paul goes into talking about why he's still rejoicing if it's not about the gift. So he gives a couple of reasons for this. The first is he circles back to just being encouraged that they're sharing in his troubles with him, which he talked about in chapter 1 at the very beginning about being partakers in his imprisonment and defense of the gospel. So that shows how even as believers we can come together and we can just show each other we are there for each other and we support each other. And then he's also encouraged to see how the Philippian church is becoming more Christ-like. In verse 17, he says, "Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. So it's not as much so about the gift as it is about the giver being made more into the image of Christ through that sacrifice. And then, speaking of sacrifice, Paul calls their gift a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. So, in the Old Testament, sacrifices were required by people, but then Jesus came as the ultimate sacrifice, so they no longer had to do these offerings and sacrifices on altars anymore. So why is Paul bringing them up? Well, this whole letter has been talking about the church participating in the story of the gospel. And just like Jesus sacrificed himself, that it means us sacrificing ourselves. That doesn't always mean our lives, but it does mean sacrificing in some way as Jesus did. And to kind of help clarify this idea, what I did is I went and I found two other passages where Paul Paul in one and then Hebrews, and whoever wrote Hebrews, talks about this sacrifice. So in Hebrews 13, verse 16, he says, "Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God." And then in Ephesians 5, verse 2, he says, "And walk in love, as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." So you can see how the wording of that is very similar to what he's saying here. So what is a sacrifice that what should our sacrifices look like today? It should look like walking in love and doing good. Finally, Paul goes into talk about how he knows that his God will supply every need. And the reason he says that is because in the culture of the day, friends would exchange gifts back and forth. If one gave one, it was on Paul to return some kind of gift, but he's in prison, so he can't do that. So he says, no, God is going to take care of that. And then this whole section, finally, because Paul loves to praise in this book, finally leads him to praise again, saying, "To our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen." So I love that, how even in circumstances, he has gratitude, and that gratitude leads him to praise. And then he just concludes with a greeting. Two questions, I guess, just to kind of leave us with today is, one, where is your source of contentment? Where or what or who even are you putting your trust in, and who are you expecting happiness from? Because we know nothing on earth is going to satisfy, because our inheritance, our unperishing, unfading inheritance, that's in heaven, and that's what we can put our hope in. And we can be content on earth because we know that. And then I guess my second question then would be, how can you offer sacrifices pleasing to God as we imitate Christ? And not sacrificing a lamb on an altar, but sacrificing, giving up ourselves, and walking in love. So I'm just going to close us in prayer, and I hope the rest of you have a great day. So, Lord God, I thank you for each person watching this video. I thank you that you have been working through our hearts during even this pandemic, God. And I pray that though the circumstances may not seem perfect, God, this is a great opportunity to teach us what it means to look like, to be content in these circumstances. And God, we lift up these difficult circumstances to you, and we ask that you would be in this pandemic and heal those who are sick and be with those who are mourning, God. But also teach us in the midst of it to be content and to see how you're working in us during this time, God. And let your strength, the strength of Christ, equip us, God, to serve you and to trust that you are a good God who is sovereign over all of this, God. And then finally, help us to be imitators of Christ. Help us to offer pleasing sacrifices to you in gifts of love and humility to others, God. Let our light just shine before others, God, so that they can look at us and say, well, what is different about them? And that they can look on us and see you reflected, and may all the glory ultimately go to you, God. Pray all this in your name. Amen. Okay, I'm only a couple seconds over, so have a great day, everybody.